Listen, what I'm about to tell you sounds impossible, but it's real. Winter of 1944, dozens of Japanese soldiers step off a train in Wisconsin. They're starving, their uniforms are held together with scraps of thread, and they've spent weeks preparing themselves to die. Because that's what they'd been taught. Capture meant the end. Americans would torture them, starve them, strip away whatever dignity they had left. So when those train doors opened and the freezing air hit their faces, they were ready for it. The beatings, the humiliation, whatever was coming. But here's the thing. What broke them wasn't violence. It wasn't cruelty. It was a hamburger and a bottle of Coca-Cola. And that's where this story gets wild, because the enemy they'd been told about turned out to be something they never saw coming. Quick thing, if you want to see how a simple meal completely shattered these soldiers' reality, hit subscribe, drop a like, and turn on that bell. What happens next is going to blow your mind. Let's get into it. So picture this. The train doors clatter open and the Wisconsin cold hits them like a wall. Snow everywhere, packed hard on the ground, and these guys are stepping down in torn uniforms that barely qualify as clothing anymore. Some of them had literally sewn their jackets back together with strips of cloth because that's all they had. Hollow cheeks, cracked lips, eyes that hadn't seen a full meal in weeks, maybe months. They're blinking against the pale winter light, and every single one of them is carrying the same thought. This is it. From day one in the Imperial Army, they'd been drilled on one thing. Capture wasn't just bad, it was worse than death. Surrender meant shame. And the stories they'd heard? Americans would beat them, humiliate them, maybe worse. So, when they stepped off that train, they weren't expecting to survive the week. Some of them had already made peace with it. But then they look around. Yeah, there's barbed wire, guard towers, rifles, sentries watching them, all the stuff you'd expect. But there's also something else, something that didn't fit the picture they'd been painted. The camp had this weird sense of order to it. Trucks rolling through on actual roads. Smoke coming from kitchen chimneys, and get this, the smell that came with it wasn't the weak soup they'd been living on. It was rich, heavy, the kind of smell that makes your stomach wake up even when you're trying to ignore it. A few of the men glanced at each other, nervous, like they were afraid to even show curiosity. Others kept their heads down, not wanting to give anything away. The guards started shouting commands in English, fast, sharp, impossible to understand unless you caught the tone. Firm, yeah, but not savage, not the screaming rage they'd expected. Interpreters moved through the lines. Line up, move forward, don't break formation. And here's where it gets strange. Red Cross people were standing off to the side with clipboards, just observing everything. That alone threw them off. Back home, they'd been told America was lawless, that it didn't care about anything. But here were outsiders watching, taking notes. What was that about? Then came the intake process. They got deloused, lice burned off, filthy uniforms tossed into a pile and set on fire. Medical checks followed, temperature taken, broken bones inspected, malnutrition measured. One soldier had a bandaged arm, infected, wrapped in dirty cloth. He sat there frozen while an American medic unwrapped it, cleaned the wound, and dressed it again with fresh gauze. The guy couldn't move. He just stared, trying to make sense of why an enemy would bother. Someone whispered to the man next to him, "Why would they do this? We're nothing to them." The other soldier shook his head. "It's a trick. Just wait." That fear stuck with them. Every step forward felt like it might be the one where the real punishment started. But each hour that passed, the punishment didn't come. Instead, they were marched across the snowy yard to their quarters. The cold cut straight through their thin coats, boots crunching through the snow, but when they got inside the barracks, heat, actual heat from stoves, bunks lined up with real mattresses and wool blankets stacked on top. Some of the men sat down carefully, pressing their palms into the mattress like they didn't trust it to stay soft. Others just stood there, staring. This was still captivity, barbed wire outside, guards with guns, but inside, it didn't feel like the dungeon they'd braced for. The contrast was eating at them. Their whole lives they'd been told that capture would strip them down to nothing, that the enemy would treat them like animals. But that first day, a guard helped a sick man stay on his feet. A medic wrapped wounds with care. People were handing out supplies fairly. They didn't relax, not even close. Suspicion sat in their chests like a second heartbeat. But as the sun went down and they lay on those cots under real blankets, the question wouldn't leave them alone. What if the nightmare they'd prepared for wasn't coming? What if this was something else entirely? They didn't have words for it yet. But the real shock, that wasn't going to come from the rules or the barracks or even the guards. It was waiting for them in the mess hall, carried on trays, smelling like nothing they'd ever experienced before. The next morning they lined up for the mess hall. Boots scraping, nobody talking, steam rising behind the counter, and that smell hit them hard. Rich, smoky, fatty. Most couldn't even place it. They'd grown up on fish and rice. This was something totally different. They're clutching their tin trays, waiting for the catch. Maybe scraps, maybe spoiled food tossed at them. Hunger twisted their stomachs, but fear kept them from looking eager. Then the first guy steps up. An American cook drops a hot patty onto a bun, adds fried potatoes, golden, crispy. Grabs a sweating glass bottle, pops the cap, slides it onto the tray. Red script on the label, totally unfamiliar. The soldier just stares like he's been handed something from another planet. "Move along," the cook says flatly. Behind him, whispers ripple down the line. "They're giving us meat. Actual meat." They sit at long wooden tables, eyeing the food like it might bite back. A few bring the bottle to their lips. The sweetness hits first. Intense, shocking. Then carbonation burns down their throats. Some gag, coughing, others go wide-eyed. One man laughs, this uncontrolled burst that startles everyone. Another covers his mouth, shoulders shaking between laughing and crying. There's this thin soldier, ribs visible under his uniform, who lifts his hamburger with both hands. He sniffs it, bites in. Grease runs down his chin. He freezes mid-chew, then lowers his face. Tears welling up. His bunkmate nudges him. "You all right?" He swallows hard. I'd forgotten what fat tasted like. At another table, two men debate quietly. "They're trying to make us weak," one argues. "Fatten us up so we forget." His friend shakes his head. Or maybe they just eat like this every day. That idea's harder to swallow than the food. The mess hall fills with quiet sounds, chewing, muffled laughter, the occasional hidden sob. For guys who'd survived on roots and scraps, this wasn't just food. It was an attack on everything they thought they knew. Here's the wildest part. The Americans serving? They didn't notice anything unusual. To them, it was routine. Same burger and fries they ate. Tuesday dinner. Nothing special. But for these men, it was like crossing into another reality. What shook them wasn't the abundance, it was how normal it all was. The Americans weren't celebrating or rubbing it in. This wasn't a feast to impress. It was just lunch. They'd been told things back home about their enemies, but seeing it firsthand, different story. Here they were as captives, eating better than when they were free. The shame cut deep, but the relief cut deeper. By the time trays were empty and bottles drained, they sat back in silence. Some folded their hands like praying. Others stared at the wall. The guards called for order, ushering them back to barracks. They filed out, still stunned, still whispering. That night, lying on their bunks, the memory wouldn't leave them. The hamburger, the Coke, the warmth. It wasn't just food anymore. It was proof their enemy lived in a completely different world. One where sweetness could be wasted on prisoners. Where meat was so common it got shaped into patties and handed out without a second thought. The shock was just starting to sink in. Days started blending together. Morning roll calls, work assignments, same routines. But the work didn't break them. They shoveled snow, cut wood, helped on farms under guard watch. Steady, not brutal. And get this, they got paid. Camp coupons they could trade at the canteen for toiletries, paper, candy, cigarettes. One afternoon, a soldier's holding up a chocolate bar, hands trembling. "Back home," he murmurs, "this is like medicine. Here they hand it out like nothing." His friend just shakes his head. The canteen messed with them. They'd watch American soldiers buying Coke and gum, joking with the clerk. War was raging across the world, yet here in Wisconsin, Americans lived like abundance would never end. But camp life had its own weight. No fighting, no losing comrades. Just monotony. Wake up, work, eat, sleep. Their minds had space to wander now. And with wandering came longing. Letters became everything. Twice a month, censored but precious. They'd hunch over tables, scratching out words. "I'm alive" was often all they managed. Some got letters back. Others got silence that grew heavier every week. English classes started in the evenings. A few attended, repeating words slowly. Bread. Table. Window. Others scoffed. No point learning the enemy's language. But even skeptics listened from their bunks. At a work site, a guard asked through an interpreter, "Do you miss rice?" The prisoner laughed bitterly. "Rice is a memory." The guard went quiet, maybe realizing the weight behind those words. Not all interactions were gentle. Some guards stayed cold. Inside the barracks, arguments flared. Some men clung to the idea their side would win. Others, worn down, muttered it was over. One night, two guys argued so loud a guard stepped in. "You dishonor everything when you speak like that," one shouted. The other snapped back, "And you dishonor reason by denying what's in front of your eyes." The tension stayed. Even in America, the war lived inside their heads. Still, life found rhythms. Men carved wooden toys, played games, told stories of home. The mess hall smell never stopped haunting them, but at least it was steady. 3 meals daily. That set this place apart from the jungle trenches they'd come from. At night, silence fell quick after lights out. But sometimes someone whispered into the dark. "What do you think your family's eating tonight?" No answers, just sighs and shifting blankets. Camp life wasn't freedom, wasn't cruelty either. Something in between. Survival was certain, but meaning felt slippery. They were alive, fed, sheltered, but also captives, cut off from everything, waiting for things to end, while living better than they ever had before. That contradiction gnawed at them every single day. Weeks passed, and something weird started happening. The language barrier began cracking, not through textbooks, but through small stuff. A guard offering a cigarette through the fence, a prisoner accepting with a stiff bow. No words needed, but something passed between them. Chewing gum became oddly funny. Guards handed it out during work details, and prisoners had no idea what to do with it. One guy chewed for 2 minutes, then swallowed it whole. The Americans lost it, laughing and shaking their heads, trying to explain through gestures. Soon, gum became this weird symbol of exchange. Then there was Miller. Young guard, maybe 20, from Illinois. He'd linger near the barracks after his shift. One day he pulled out photographs of his family. Mother, father, 2 little sisters. The prisoners couldn't understand his words, but they understood the faces. One prisoner crouched down, started sketching in the dirt with a stick. His village, his house, his wife somewhere across the ocean. Other men joined in, drawing their own homes. It wasn't dialogue exactly, but they were communicating. Miller said slowly, "Mother, father, sisters." He pointed to the photos. A prisoner touched his chest, said in Japanese, "Ha ha ha, chichi, imoto." Same words, different sounds. The exchange lasted maybe a minute before another guard called Miller away. But they'd spoken across the gap. Not everything was warm. On a farm outside camp, a work crew was clearing fields when the farmer showed up. His son had been lost in the Pacific, hatred in his stare. When a prisoner bent to pick up a dropped tool, the farmer spat near his feet. The guard noticed, walked closer. The tension hung there, thick and raw. The farmer turned away, muttering. That moment spread through camp fast. "Not all of them are the same," one said grimly. His bunkmate replied, "Of course not. They're men like us. Some will hate, some won't." Late one night, a prisoner wrote in his diary by candlelight, "We were told they were animals. Yet they share their gum, they heal our wounds, they show us their families. Which is the lie?" He didn't write an answer because he didn't have one. The contradictions were everywhere. Some prisoners attending English classes got accused of betraying their honour. "Every word you learn chips away at who you are," one insisted. Another shot back, "Or maybe it keeps us alive." Maybe survival matters more. Nobody won those arguments. They just went to sleep angry. But the moments kept happening. A prisoner stumbling on ice, a guard pulling him up. No kick, no insult, just a quick nod. It was deeply confusing. These were supposed to be enemies. The hate should have been simple. Instead, it was getting messy. One evening, an American soldier walked by, stopped, pulled out cigarettes. He offered one through the wire. A prisoner accepted, bowed slightly. The American nodded back. They both stood there smoking in silence, watching the sun go down over Wisconsin snow. No words, just two guys having a smoke. That night, someone whispered the question that had been building. If we survive and go home, what do we tell people? That our enemy fed us, smiled at us, showed us kindness? Another voice answered quietly. We tell them the truth, even if no one believes us. The wire was still there, the towers, the rifles, but something had shifted. The enemy wasn't faceless anymore. He had a name, Miller, a family in Illinois. He laughed when prisoners swallowed gum. The lines were blurring in ways that made everything harder. Because hating a monster is simple. But what do you do when the monster offers you a cigarette and asks about your family? Letters from home started arriving more regularly, and that's when things got really hard. Not the kind of hard you'd expect, no beatings, no starvation, but something heavier. A guy would get a letter and read it quietly in his bunk, and you'd see his face just collapse. One soldier opened an envelope from his wife. She wrote about how the family was surviving on boiled weeds and scraps of barley, how the kids were always hungry, how they'd learned to make soup from grass and roots. He held that letter in shaking hands while the smell of roast beef drifted in from the mess hall. That night, he didn't touch his dinner, just sat there staring at the tray. The distance between their lives and the lives back home became impossible to process. 3 meals a day, every single day, hamburgers, potatoes, bread, meat. Meanwhile, their families were rationing whatever they could find. Their kids were going to bed hungry. Their parents were getting weaker. And here they were, captives, eating better than they'd eaten as free men. "I'm alive and fed," one prisoner muttered to his bunkmate, "while my children starve. What kind of life is this?" His friend had no answer. On work details outside the camp, they'd see American farms, tractors rolling through fields that seemed endless, barns full of livestock, crops stretching to the horizon. One guard, overhearing a prisoner comment on it, said casually, "This is just Wisconsin. You should see Illinois." The prisoner lowered his eyes, ashamed of the envy burning inside him. What they were seeing didn't match anything they'd expected. The abundance wasn't for show. It was just normal, everyday life. That realization hit different for everyone. Some men clung harder to what they'd been raised to believe. Others started questioning quietly, afraid to say it out loud. One evening, a prisoner whispered through tears, "Everything I thought I knew. I don't understand anymore." His bunkmate immediately scolded him, warned him never to speak like that again. But the confusion was out there now, and it wouldn't go away. Then there was the afternoon with the child. A work crew was clearing a road outside camp when a group of American kids approached. Curious, cheeks red from the cold. One little girl, maybe 7 or 8, walked right up to the fence. She was holding a candy bar, and she just held it out through the wire, offering it to one of the prisoners. The soldier froze. He'd faced bombs, bullets, starvation. But this? An innocent gesture from a child of the enemy? It terrified him more than any weapon. His hands trembled as he slowly reached out and took the candy. He bowed, low, deep, and managed to say in broken English, "Thank you." The girl smiled and skipped back to her friends. That night, he couldn't stop shaking. He told his bunkmates, "A child gave me food with a smile." How am I supposed to hate her? How do I carry that? Nobody had an answer for him either. The contradictions weren't just confusing anymore. They were crushing. Some prisoners started avoiding the mess hall, unable to stomach the guilt. Others ate quickly, mechanically, trying not to think about it. A few wrote letters home, but lied, saying conditions were harder than they were. They couldn't bring themselves to admit the truth. Late one night, a group sat in the barracks talking in hushed voices. "The guilt is worse than anything else," one said carefully. Another shook his head. "Don't even talk about it." But they were all feeling it. That was the problem. The camp wasn't breaking them with cruelty. It was breaking them with comfort, with 3 meals and warm beds and moments of unexpected kindness. Because how do you reconcile that? How do you go home and explain that captivity felt safer than freedom? That the enemy fed you while your family starved? One prisoner started keeping a secret journal, hiding it under his mattress. He wrote, "The hardest prison isn't made of wire and guns. It's made of guilt and gratitude fighting inside your chest. I don't know which one will win." The wire was still there. The guards still watched. But the real cage was the one they were building inside themselves, brick by brick, meal by meal, kindness by kindness. And that cage? There was no escaping it, even after the war ended. Summer came to Wisconsin, and with it, whispers. Rumors started racing through the camp faster than guards could shut them down. Something big was happening outside the wire, cities burning, battles lost. The men caught fragments of news from work details, from guards' conversations, from the tension in the air that you could almost taste. Then, one morning, they got the words nobody thought they'd hear. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. The announcement fell over camp like a weight nobody knew how to lift. Some prisoners just stared at the ground, frozen. Others walked back to their bunks and lay down, facing the wall. A few wept quietly, shoulders shaking under thin blankets. They'd carried one belief through everything, that their nation couldn't fall, that death was better than this moment. And now here it was, and they were alive to see it. Alive and behind barbed wire, unable to do anything about it. Days passed in this weird quiet. The guards didn't celebrate, didn't rub it in, they just kept doing what they'd always done. Roll calls, meal times, work details. For a lot of the prisoners, that steady routine felt almost cruel, like nothing had changed when everything had changed. "They treat us the same," one man whispered bitterly, "like it doesn't matter what just happened. Do they not see what this means to us?" But maybe that was the point. Maybe they did see, and keeping things normal was the only mercy they could offer. The camp started preparing for what came next: repatriation. That word got passed around, and it took a while for everyone to understand what it meant. They were going home. Red Cross officials began organizing lists, transportation routes, schedules. The prisoners got medical checkups, more thorough this time, clean uniforms, briefings about the journey ahead. Going home should have felt like relief, but it didn't, not entirely. They'd be going back across the Pacific not as the soldiers they'd imagined being, but as men who'd survived something they never expected. What would be waiting for them? Families, yeah. But what else? Cities in ruins. People who'd judge them for living when others hadn't? The questions sat heavy in every man's chest. The morning of departure came without fanfare. They filed out of the barracks carrying small bundles. Some had wooden carvings they'd made during long evenings. Others clutched letters from home, stained and worn from being read too many times. As they moved through the gates, a lot of them glanced back, one last look at the camp that had held them. It wasn't fondness exactly, more like confusion that wouldn't quit. This place where they'd expected the worst and gotten something they still couldn't fully explain. Hamburgers and Coca-Cola, heated barracks, guards who sometimes pulled them up when they stumbled, kids offering candy through fences. The journey back was long and heavy. On the ship, men huddled together, not talking much, just thinking, wondering what remained of home. They worried about being seen as failures, about families who might not recognize them anymore, about the shame they'd carry for having survived at all. But there was another memory they couldn't shake, no matter how hard they tried. That first meal at Camp McCoy. The way the sweetness of Coke burned down their throats, the grease from a hamburger running down their chins, the warmth of wool blankets on a Wisconsin winter night. One man pulled out a worn notebook and wrote carefully, "I thought my enemy would break me with violence. Instead, he broke me with food. I can't erase the taste of bread and meat and sweetness. It'll follow me home like a shadow I can't outrun." The ship cut through the Pacific, carrying them toward an uncertain future. They were going home, yes, but they weren't the same men who'd left. They'd seen something that didn't fit into any story they'd been told. They'd tasted something that changed the shape of everything, and now they had to figure out how to live with that, how to explain it, or whether they should even try. When they finally stepped onto Japanese soil, reality hit like a punch. Bombed-out ruins where cities used to stand, buildings reduced to rubble, streets barely recognizable. This was real, and they were standing in it. Families met them at the docks, those who could make it. Tears. Relief mixed with something harder to name. Some wives and children had survived on grass, tree bark, roots. Others hadn't made it at all. The stories came in bits and pieces, each one landing heavy. And then came the looks. Not everyone was happy to see them. Whispers followed them. You survived while others didn't? The accusation was clear even when unspoken. One man tried telling his brother about Camp McCoy, about the food, the warmth, the unexpected moments. His brother's face went cold. "You're telling me you ate well while we starved?" While Mother died. The conversation ended there. He never brought it up again. That became the pattern. The hamburgers, the Coca-Cola, the guards who showed family photos, nobody wanted to hear it. It felt wrong to talk about being treated decently when everyone at home had been through hell. So most just stopped talking. They buried those memories deep, covered them with duty and routine and rebuilding. Some threw themselves into work, never mentioning the war. Others would wake up at night tasting sweetness they couldn't shake. The guilt was its own kind of prison, worse than the barbed wire. They'd eaten 3 meals while their families scraped by on one. They'd slept warm while their children shivered. They'd survived while others hadn't. Years passed. Decades. Most kept quiet, carrying their contradictions in silence. But a few, when they got older, started talking. Carefully. Usually just to family when the weight got too heavy. One man, sitting with his grown son late one evening, finally let some of it out. The son expected horror stories. Instead, his father went quiet for a long time. Then he said something the son never forgot. "I learned something in America that I've never been able to shake. Kindness is harder to carry than cruelty. Cruelty you can fight against, you can hate it. But kindness from someone you were taught to see as a monster, that stays with you. It changes something inside that you can't change back." His son didn't know what to say. They just sat there in silence, the old man staring at nothing, probably tasting something from 40 years ago that still wouldn't let him go. The men who'd lived through Camp McCoy carried those memories to their graves. Some never spoke a word. Others whispered fragments to people they trusted. But whether they talked or stayed silent, the experience marked them. Because they'd learned something that didn't fit any simple story. They'd learned that enemies could be human, that humanity could show up in the strangest places, in a mess hall, in a bottle of Coke, in a guard's photograph, in a child's candy bar through a fence. And maybe that's the hardest truth. Not that war is brutal, everyone knows that, but that even in war there are moments that refuse to fit the narrative, moments that force you to see your enemy as something other than a monster. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. You just have to live with it. So yeah, that's the story nobody talks about. Japanese soldiers who walked into Camp McCoy in 1944 expecting torture and got hamburgers instead. Men who thought capture meant the end but found themselves living better than they had as free soldiers. It wasn't about winning or losing at that point. It was about those small moments that stuck with them forever. A cook sliding a tray across a counter without a second thought. A guard named Miller showing pictures of his family. A child offering candy through a fence. These weren't grand gestures. They were just Tuesday. Normal life for the Americans. But for the prisoners, those moments shattered everything they thought they knew. Here's the thing that gets me about this story. We love clear lines. Good guys, bad guys. Heroes, villains. But real life doesn't work like that, does it? These men learned the hard way that your enemy can feed you, heal your wounds, show you kindness, and that makes everything more complicated, not less. Decades later, one of those prisoners told his son that kindness is harder to carry than cruelty. Because cruelty you can fight against, you can hate it, but kindness from someone you're supposed to hate? That changes you. That follows you home. That makes you question everything. The wire and the towers and the guards, that wasn't what imprisoned them. It was the guilt and the gratitude fighting inside their chests. The memory of that first Coca-Cola. The warmth of those wool blankets. The taste of fat they'd forgotten existed. Those things became their real cage, and there was no escaping it. War strips away a lot of things, but it can't erase the power of small human moments, a shared cigarette, a photograph in the dirt, a smile from a kid who didn't know any better. Those moments, they last longer than battles. They cut deeper than any weapon. So maybe the lesson isn't about Camp McCoy specifically. Maybe it's about remembering that even in the darkest times, when everything tells you to hate, humanity has this weird way of showing up in places it shouldn't. And when it doesn't make things simpler. It makes them messier, harder, more real. Those men carried that mess with them for the rest of their lives. Some never spoke about it. Others whispered it late at night when the weight got too heavy. But they all knew one truth. Once you see your enemy as human, you can't unsee it. And maybe that's not such a bad thing to remember. If this story hit you the way it hit me, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and drop a like. There's so much buried history like this that deserves to be told, stories that don't fit the neat boxes we try to put them in. I'm digging these up constantly, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Turn on notifications too, because these stories, they won't stay buried forever, but they need people willing to listen. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.